Hi, I'm Ricky Safer, founder and CEO of PSC Partners Seeking a Cure, and I'm here tonight with Mary Vias, president of PSC Partners Seeking a Cure Canada, to welcome everyone to our roadmap kickoff tonight. The acronym ROADMAP stands for Research Objectives and Development Meetings to Accelerate Progress. That is a mouthful to say, but during this webinar, we will explain what ROADMAP is all about and what your role will be in this exciting initiative. Together, we will be creating the community journey on the road to our 2022 in-person conference in Boston. In addition to our traditional conference agenda, in 2022, we'll be bringing together global PSC expert clinicians and researchers to discuss among themselves and with our patient community the current hot topics in PSC research. Next slide, please.
The Roadmap Initiative is the outcome of work that has been ongoing over the past few years. In January of 2020, we announced that PSC Partners was selected as one of 30 rare disease organizations to receive the first CZI Rarest One grant. A primary goal of this grant is the launching of the PSC Partners Organized International Collaborative Research Network. Yes, another mouthful. And hopefully by the end of today's webinar, we will have explained clearly what that is. In October 2020, PSC Partners hosted an externally led, patient-focused drug development meeting with the FDA, known as the PFDD, or Making Our Voices Heard. Our community stepped up in a huge way to share their experiences living with PSC. One of the outcomes of this meeting is a collection of tangible deliverables, patient testimonial videos, voice of the patient report, and the Our Voices survey data. And the PSC Partners Patient Registry now has over 1,800 participants from around the world. Our registry, started by Rachel Gomel and Ricky, and now led by Rachel, is, among other things, a systematic way to collect aggregate patient data and securely communicate research opportunities to participants and de-identified data for research studies. A rare disease, with each medical center having a small number of PSC patients, for a rare disease with each medical center having a small number of PSC patients, this is a real value. The vision of the role of PSC Partners in research and drug development is expanding, both as a patient organization and as a patient community. Before we delve into how we see it expanding, let's revisit what's been accomplished. Over the past 17 years, PSC Partners has been successful in providing education and support to those living with PSC. This will continue to be a priority. While we have sorely missed our in-person gatherings, one outcome of providing programming remotely is that many more are able to access these programs through webinars and Zoom room support meetings. The plan is to continue what is working well. We will also continue our competitive research grant program, which has awarded over $4 million to PSC research, and we encourage researchers to apply for funding for novel PSC research. The Roadmap Initiative is about an expanded patient role in research and drug development and how patient participation can work to accelerate progress. The rare disease landscape has changed dramatically over the past 17 years, and we are observing a new paradigm for patient input and partnership in rare disease work. Next slide, please.
We see this new paradigm of requesting patient input and perspective and partnership in our various relationships with regulatory agencies, the FDA and EMA, issuing guidances on including the patient perspective, and with PSC researchers and industry signaling an interest in working closely with us. Legislators are also on board with examples such as the 21st Century Cures Act, funding research with provisions to support patient involvement. You may be wondering, what does our patient community bring to the table for research and drug development? First, we have built a trustworthy relationship with the medical community, including funding research studies. Two, we collaborate with, but are independent of any academic institution. Three, we have a direct connection to PSC patients globally. Four, we as patients can best describe symptoms and assess our quality of life. And 5, we clearly have an unmatched urgency in the quest for treatments and a cure. Next slide, please.
Each year, an enormous amount of planning and work goes into the annual patient conference. The team at PSC Partners spends about a year behind the scenes working with the hosting medical center to plan the event. The upcoming 2022 conference is going to be a bit different in that it will include the launch of the Collaborative Research Network, and the planning and preparation is also going to be different. This year, planning and preparation will include the community, both researchers and patients, in providing input and preparing participants to become as informed as possible in the year leading up to the conference. That is what Roadmap is all about, a participatory preparation for the 2022 conference and the launch of the Collaborative Research Network. More explicitly, the goals of Roadmap: accelerating progress to find therapies and a cure by educating the patient community on the research landscape, broadening the researcher base and strengthening multi-stakeholder communication, and creating opportunities for researchers and clinicians to engage in meaningful discussions with an informed patient community, all to set the stage for a successful 2022 conference and the launch of the PSC Partners Organized International Collaborative Research Network. Again, that mouthful. Our fourth presenter today, Dr. Ruth-Anne has firsthand successful experience with a collaborative research network in a different rare disease, and we'll be sharing more about this tonight. Next slide, please.
Logistically, how do we plan to accomplish our goals while infusing the patient voice at every step of Roadmap? Tonight is the first of a series of webinars and group discussions that will take place from April 2021 until April 2022. We will be focusing on 6 major topic areas to be decided that represent current gaps in PSC research, and we will hold 2 webinars on each topic. Naming these like college courses, the first webinar for each topic will be a 101 session with background information to help us understand the basic and advanced concepts and terminology around that topic. All stakeholders may attend these 101 webinars, which will provide strategies for engaging later with clinicians and researchers in the 201 webinar. The second webinar for each topic will be a 201 session with medical and scientific experts leading discussions and attended by clinicians, researchers, patients, caregivers, and industry, sharing ideas in these multi-stakeholder discussions. You don't have to attend 101 sessions in order to attend the following 201 sessions, but is highly recommended. As to be decided, we envision a combination of large and small group discussions, perhaps some journal club sessions, and other formats. Recordings of all webinars will be available on our website. To be honest, originally, we had planned to include in tonight's kickoff a list of future webinars with topics and dates, but then we decided that would defeat our purpose of planning our important roadmap journey with input from all stakeholders in the PSC landscape. We will choose our final research topics after asking for opinions and comments from you, PSCers and caregivers, PSC Partners leadership, our Scientific Medical Advisory Committee, and past grant recipients. The final topics will range anywhere from PSC genetics, the microbiome in PSC, ways to increase diversity of PSC patients in our programs and in research studies, or any topic suggestions sent to us either in tonight's chat, in tonight's survey, or throughout the year on the Roadmap Initiative page of our website. Next slide, please.
So here you can see our very full agenda for tonight's webinar. We'd also like to take this opportunity to introduce a new member of the PSC Partners community, this very happy liver that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. This positive, friendly, and welcoming image of a happy liver showing all of the Roadmap stakeholders has been chosen to put a positive spin on the Roadmap initiative. And this happy liver is so far unnamed. In the theme of patient input, we'd like your help. We're kicking off Roadmap crowdsourcing by asking the patient community to send gender-neutral name ideas. If you have ideas now tonight, go ahead and enter them into the chat. On the PSC Partners website, there is a roadmap page, as Ricky just mentioned, where you can also submit any comments as well as name suggestions. In the near future, we'll all have a chance to vote on a list of finalist names. Please stay tuned for announcements in the duct and on social media about how to vote. So that's our intro to the Roadmap Initiative. And after the presentations to come, we look forward to hearing what you think. Before we get started with the presentations, and without further ado, it is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Joshua Korzenik, Director of the Resnick Family Research Center for PSC and Director of the Crohn's and Colitis Center at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. He is involved in clinical care of people with these diseases. His research is focused on developing new therapies for PSC based on a better understanding of PSC and IBD. Dr. Korzenik joined our Scientific Medical Advisory Committee last year. He is co-host for our in-person conference in 2022 and the research lead for our CZI Rare as One grant. Dr. Korzenik will announce exciting news about our 2022 Patient Caregiver Conference. His topic is Roadmap, the PSC Partners Organized International Collaborative Research Network, and the 2022 conference. Go ahead, please, Dr. Korzenik.
Thanks very much, and delighted to be here. And delighted also to be able to say that the conference next in 2022, as you know now, will be in Boston. Next. And we certainly had hoped that this conference would have taken place earlier, but COVID really upended all of our plans, as it has in so much in life recently. But we see this as probably a silver lining. We've had a very interesting time and a really very fortunate time in terms of planning and in terms of this grant. So to go into a little bit more detail about the grant, next, please. Well, first about Boston, actually. Next, please. So we are really delighted to welcome everyone to Boston. And I think that for many of you, you may have an image of this as Boston, and it certainly can be this way, but we're going to be doing it more in spring. In early June of 2022. Next, please. So that it really is a delightful place, and even today was actually approximated spring. I know that those of you in the Midwest, and I think Ricky is probably still digging out, and Chris has probably had a lovely time of warm weather all along, but we're just getting into that time. And so we look forward to welcoming you, next please, to beautiful Boston. And it really, particularly in that time, it's really just wonderful. And we're also excited that we will be able to be together. Many of you may not be able to join us, and we still will be having a component which will be online for people, for people to participate. But we're hoping, as was just discussed, to really have a different kind of conference. And that's what we really want to really begin the conference in a certain way now, that we didn't want to have just a conference where it's a one-time event where there's education and then everyone goes on their way. There will be that. But really the goal is something broader to help shape the trajectory of PSC Partners and PSC research more broadly. Next, please. This effort has grown out of the CZI, or the Chan-Zuckerberg Initiative. Zuckerberg, I'm sure most of you know Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. He married Priscilla Chan, who was a pediatrician. And she had the really wonderful idea of creating a program which are called Rare as One, focused in on rare diseases. And I think as a pediatrician, she became much more familiar with rare diseases and wanted to be able to leverage the strengths and knowledge of Facebook and how to bring together a community with her own interests in medicine, and really bringing the patient voice together in a full and equal partnership. Next, please. RARES 1 is really directed to support rare disease advocacy organizations to develop a patient-led collaborative research network. So what does that really mean? Next. That I think when we look at where medicine was 30, 40, 50 years ago, and there was much more of a paternalistic component with the physician, not exactly the high priest, but something along that lines, sort of guiding care or dictating care, it's really shifted now to being much more of a partnership. The same way they want to bring that to research and make it much more of a partnership. And part of this grant, which was really a testament to the strength of PSC Partners that it was awarded this grant, is to expand infrastructure and really to develop a patient-led research agenda. And as part of that is to organize a conference focusing on expanding the research agenda as a collaborative effort between all the stakeholders, so patients, care providers, and researchers, physicians, and others in the process. And so we're really embarking on this roadmap together to try to figure out how to do this. Next, please. So we wanted to start early. We wanted to build up the knowledge base of everyone who's going to be there. So both to understand better, even though we're involved in the care of people with PSC, it doesn't mean that we're fully aware of all of their thoughts, understandings, and ideas about where research should go, what are the needs, how to make this happen. We also recognize that there's a factor of intimidation. In the same way, certainly when my mother first was approaching a computer, she felt like this is more than she can do. There's an intimidation factor that I had as well when I started getting into research, and all of the fairly off-putting names and abbreviations seems hard to understand. We want to help people break through that and give people a strong footing and a strong sense of what some of the issues are, and get everyone's voice in the process. Next, please. So we really want to develop a research agenda with a patient voice guiding this. Next, please. We see it as a collaborative effort. It's not the researchers or physicians leading the way. It's everyone finding our way together and really understanding where we need to go and how to get there. Next, please. Prior to the conference, we want to have as much discussion, education, and collaborative effort. So, we have some structure in mind, as Ricky pointed out, but we also want to figure out how to get to the conference with a lot of the efforts and understandings already on the road to progress, so that when we get to the conference, it is one important way station, but it's not the end in itself. It's a way of bringing together a lot of the efforts that will go on over the next year of education, of thinking through some of these issues, of thinking through what are some of the focuses that researchers should be involved in, what should be the role of PSC Partners, how can we enhance our efforts, how can we bring together other communities, how do we do a better job of recruiting, what are some of the things we should be focusing in on. And again, I really think it's got to be a joint effort. So we don't want people to say, well, what do I know? I didn't go to medical school, or I'm not a scientist. We think that sometimes sort of lack of knowledge is the greatest strength. So often when we're on rounds in the hospital, often the best questions come from the medical student who doesn't really know as much yet. It's sometimes the obvious things that we overlook, or sometimes the things that we think we know that we don't. And so we really want to have everyone's involvement, thanks, and be able to move forward together to make this a really successful effort. So how this is going to happen, we're working on this. We want people to really think carefully about how to proceed with this process, and we'll really invite your participation along the way. Next, please. So we ask you to speak boldly, don't be intimidated. Please join us in this process. And I think the more of you who are involved and think of this not just as a conference that'll happen in a year from now, but really a process that we're all going to be a part of together, I think then we hope that we can really help move the whole field together. Thanks very much. Thanks for your involvement and participation. And I will turn this back to Mary.
Thank you so much, Dr. Korzenik. That was a fantastic explanation of what we're hoping to achieve with this process over the next year. Could we please launch the first poll? All right, poll question 1. Traditionally, we start our conference with the Thursday evening dinner. Since our community last met in person in 2019, would you be interested in arriving early if the program began at 1 p.m. on Thursday to include more social time? Okay, it looks like, there we go. Okay, it looks like not everybody, but there's about 61% of our attendees are interested in starting the conference earlier, with another 22% maybes and 17% for whom that does not work. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Dr. Chris Bowlus, who is the Lena Valente Professor of Medicine and the Chief of the Division of Gastroenterology and Hepatology at the University of California, Davis School of Medicine. His research in autoimmune liver disease includes the first published study of a biologic for the treatment of PBC, as well as key studies of the immune pathogenesis of PSC. He chairs the Consortium for Autoimmune Liver Disease, CALID, a group he founded and which now includes 24 institutions throughout North America. Dr. Bowlus has been a longtime supporter of PSC Partners and serves in many important roles: co-chair of the Scientific Medical Advisory Committee, advisor to our patient registry, and clinical lead for the CZI Rare as One grant. Please welcome Dr. Bowlus, who will be speaking on the PSC Partners Patient Registry. Go ahead, please.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Pleasure to be here and talk to you about the registry and how it fits into this roadmap. Next slide, please. So I think many of you are very familiar with the PSC Partners Patient Registry. And in fact, you may be a participant in it. I wanted to spend a little bit of time, though, giving a little some background in what a patient registry is and why we have them, why they're important, and then specifically why is the PSC Partners Registry unique compared to other registries that are ongoing, including ones that I'm involved with myself. Next slide. So the definition of a patient registry is given in this little sentence here of an organized system that uses observational study methods to collect uniform data in order to evaluate specified outcomes for a population defined by a particular disease, condition, or exposure, and that serves predetermined scientific, clinical, or policy purposes. So kind of a mouthful, but I think you can break it down into that these are observational studies. That is, we're observing things that happen over time. This could be in a group of individuals that are in a clinical trial and were exposed to some drug or treatment. So that is a patient registry of a sort, but usually we're referring to people that aren't in a clinical trial. We're just observing them in a real world situation. And what's really important is that there's uniform data collection. It's the data collection and the methods that we use that are really central to having valid, usable, useful information in which we can do very rigorous analysis. And we're looking for very specific outcomes, whether that is liver transplantation or it could be outcomes of symptoms of pruritus, fatigue, itching, or fatigue. And it's usually confined, obviously, to a particular disease or condition or exposure. And it's to serve a specific function. Sometimes that may be scientific, and really for these registries, oftentimes it's it's multifold. It's scientific, it's clinical, as well as policy. Next slide. And so how registries are generally set up is that there is a platform or database upon which information is collected and gathered. And there are various ways in which that information is collected. A lot of the data comes from what would be considered a clinical data set or clinical portal. And as electronic medical records have grown extensively and the medical data that's available in digital format has increased, this has become a very important source of information, but there are many obstacles to its use, and mainly because the data is very fragmented and non-uniform. So even within a single institution, for example, at my institution, if I want to look at even simple liver biochemistries, it may be quite difficult because over time they have been coded differently. And so to make sure that when I'm looking at a specific liver biochemistry in 2020, it's coded the same as when it's collected in 2010 can be quite difficult. And you can imagine that if we're talking about reports such as MRCPs or liver biopsies, it gets even more complicated when there's text and not, quantifiable information. But increasingly, clinical data is growing and collection of it's getting easier, but there's still obstacles. And then there's research information, assays done of inflammatory markers or things that aren't done in regular clinical practice that might be entered into this data set. And importantly, particularly for the PSC Partners Registry, is that this is primarily patient or caregiver reported information. It could be valid information that is coming from the clinical portal, that is clinical data, laboratory values, et cetera, that are entered by the patient or a report uploaded by the patient. And more importantly, probably, that's also a way in which symptoms and other information that's not collected in the clinical realm can be entered and collected in this platform. And then it can get even more complicated if this platform is linked to other networks or other sites. And PSC Partners essentially has its own single registry, but outside of PSC Partners, there are other registries where individual sites may be collecting information, and then that is gathered and collected into a single data set to expand the number of participants. Next slide. So once you have all this data, what is it good for? Well, this is where the fun begins, and we actually get to learn something about from all this data we've collected. And there are a couple of different ways that studies can be conducted from these patient registries. And that is, we can do prospective studies or retrospective studies. Now, the determination of whether a study is prospective or retrospective is really dependent on the viewpoint of the researcher. So if the researcher is collecting data at the very beginning and then following the participants along over time, that's prospective. Whereas if the researcher is looking back into medical records or asking patients to recall what happened 10 years ago, that data is collected retrospectively. Now, they each have their advantages and disadvantages, and most of these patient registries have collected retrospective data. That is, we've looked at our patients we have in our databases and our clinical practice, and we look back at their laboratory values, what kinds of outcomes they had when they had their liver transplant. But that gets biased because only certain data is collected. There may be recall bias, and there can be other pieces of information that we miss that may be more important than what is actually collected in a retrospective study. But the advantage is it's very cheap and can be done relatively quickly. The better studies are more prospective studies where we can, in a defined fashion, collect that data. However, it's time consuming and that we won't know anything for years until these events occur. And it's also very expensive to perform these. Next slide. Now, why are registries important? Well, what they're really good for is understanding the natural history of a disease such as PSC, particularly one that takes so long for outcomes to occur, a slowly progressive disease. And this helps us develop accurate prognostic tools. So when the patients come to us in clinic and we're trying to give some idea of what to expect in the coming years, we have some scientific basis upon which to base this on, and not calling the psychic from down the street.
Dr. Bowlus, you have 2 minutes left.
Oh, well, this is going to be quick. There's also other important things in terms of developing surrogate markers for clinical outcomes and understanding who will likely benefit from treatments in the future. Next slide. There are multiple databases currently ongoing outside of PSC Partners. I just showed this. They're being done in a collaborative fashion, and they collect data that's different than what PSC Partners collect in some settings. Next slide. And what's really important is that PSC Partners gives us a different viewpoint of what's going on in the PSC community. And that's represented here in terms of transplant-free survival, which if you look at the PSC Partners Registry or non-transplant center, liver transplant centers, show much better outcomes compared to studies done at transplant centers. Next slide. And so this is why the PSC Partners Registry is so important, is that there's always bias in any of these patient registries. If we go to a dog show and ask people whether they prefer cats or dogs, we're going to get some obvious selection bias there. And the same is true if we look only at patients that go to specialized centers. Now, it's important to recognize that PSC Partners has its own biases as well. Next slide. The other thing PSC Partners Registry allows us to do is get very big. It allows participation of people with PSC who aren't close to or can't get access to one of these specialized centers that's involved in these other patient registries. And the bigger we can Next slide. The next slide, I think, shows, there we go. The next slide shows just a illustration of the blind men looking at the elephant, and each one thinks it's something different, whether they're touching the trunk and feeling a snake or thinking it's a spear when they touch the tusk. And it's important for us all to recognize that when we do our patient registries, they're all looking at a little bit different piece of the elephant. And hopefully if we combine them all together, we'll get something that looks somewhat like an elephant, though maybe not completely the truth. Next slide. And so finally, just a couple of examples of where the PSC patient registry has been helpful. This is a study looking at symptoms in PSC, which was very, I think, important in showing some of the symptoms we, as clinicians, don't always think about, such as sleep disturbances. Next slide. We've been able to do a study of pregnancy in women using the registry. Next slide. As well as looking at the acceptability of dietary modification in PSC patients. Next slide. And so the PSC patient registry is a really important resource. It's uses only de-identified data. It's reviewed annually by an ethics board, and provides an incredible resource for the PSC patient community and is really unique in that ability. I'm going to leave it there. I think and hand it back to Mary. I think, Mary, you were going to mention something about the COVID study, and I don't want to go too far over my time to go into that this time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bowlus. So what Dr. Bowlus was referring to is that PSC Partners is working with Dr. Bowlus and another researcher to potentially do a study of vaccine antibody response to the COVID-19 vaccine in PSCers. And we will be, once that is up and ready to launch, we will be contacting participants in the registry to see if they have interest in joining that study. So this is an excellent time to join the registry. Actually, it's always an excellent time to join the registry. But thank you so much, Dr. Bowlus. Can we please launch the next poll? Polling question 2. If you have not yet joined the PSC Patient Registry, what concerns are holding you back? Please choose all that apply. The first choice, I have intended to, but have not had time to fill it out. The second, I am not comfortable completing an online survey. The third, I have questions to ask before I feel comfortable sharing my information. Next, I prefer not to share my information with PSC partners. Next, I do not understand why joining a registry is important. And then finally, if you have some other concern that's not listed here, please mark it. And the responses, let's see, about 36% intend to, but have not had the time to fill it out. And then there are 57% who have another concern. So I am going to ask those of you with other concerns, please send an email to either to contact us at pscpartners.org or registry coordinator at pscpartners.org and let us know. We'd be happy to talk with you and maybe we can explain and maybe alleviate some of your concerns. Our next speaker is Dr. Veronica Miller, PhD in immunology and adjunct professor at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health and executive director of the Forum for Collaborative Research. She is an expert in regulatory science and serves on numerous industry and government advisory boards. PSC Partners has been an active member of the PSC Forum, which Dr. Miller started in 2017. The PSC Forum is an international, independent, multi-stakeholder organization that identifies gaps in PSC research to accelerate drug development. Dr. Miller was co-moderator of our recent PFDD, Patient-Focused Drug Development Forum, and tonight she will discuss the history of patient advocacy in drug development.
Thank you, Mary. It's such an honor to be with this group again. I agree that although COVID has had such, and sometimes horrid impacts on our lives, the fact that we are all getting used to meeting in this way, I think really is a silver lining. And I look forward to all the other webinars that PSC Partners is planning to launch before the 2022 meeting. And really, really look forward to that. And congratulations for all of the achievements that you have realized with the CZI and all of your activities. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. So basically, I wanted to spend some time reflecting on the HIV experience because that really was such a key moment in bringing the patient voice to the fore. It really had not existed before that there would have been the thought of patients being involved in discussing what kinds of research would be happening, how drugs get approved, et cetera, just had never occurred to anyone. Next slide, please. So it was a very devastating epidemic, of course, in the early days. And it was all about suddenly things appearing, people dying left and right. And it wasn't just the people dying, it was how they died that was so horrible. There was so much that was unknown. There was so much fear and there was so much stigma. And what happened is that the people affected, and not just the patient, but the whole affected community, the patient's friends and the patient's families came together. Next slide, please. Next, please. With resolve, next, and action. So really they were able to galvanize around this devastation and really, start to address what they could do to change the course of action. And so HIV/AIDS, of course, was very different from PSC. It came up very, very suddenly. It was previously an unknown disease. Suddenly it was there, it was everywhere, and people galvanized. It's different from PSC. Of course, PSC is not as common. It's a rare disease. And so many of the patients have been living with it for so long, the families, this generation, also previous generations. And it's really about a PSC patient and a patient voice for PSC coming together after so many decades of recognizing that the disease existed, but very little opportunity for common action. And PSC Partners throughout the years has really changed that. Next slide, please. And this is just one of the many graphics that the community developed at that point, but I really wanted to show this because it really is so incredibly important. Silence equals death. And that message was carried on T-shirts, on posters, on it was just all over the place, and really challenging people to do away with the stigma and really just address what was going on. And the idea that unless everyone comes together and speaks about it and plans and galvanizes around an issue, it really would just spell death. Next, please. And here is one of the many pictures that I think some of you may have seen, many of them, just the kind of activism that the HIV/AIDS epidemic elicited at the very beginning, and a lot of theatrics. But we will talk about the value of theatrics and how this really helped in the overall development of the patient voice. Next slide, please. So what have we learned from all of this? Basically, I think we can say that there are some key ingredients for advocacy success based on the HIV/AIDS experience, which, by the way, has then also many of those activists went on to become activists and advocates for hepatitis C, for hepatitis B, for tuberculosis, and other global diseases. So one of the first ingredients for success is attention. And you just saw some of these slides that I showed about how some of these theatrical approaches were used. And I think what we have now is in those days it had to be theatrics because there was no other way to express the patient voice. Now, of course, we have something like patient-focused drug development meetings. What a big, long way we have come since that original attempt by people to really have the patients have their voices heard. Knowledge is so important, and this is another area where PSC Partners has really excelled so much. So what happened with the first generation of activists and the training they provided for subsequent generations, really it was all about knowledge. And I can tell you, I was at some of these early AIDS conferences where we were trying to figure out the best treatments. The AIDS activists and advocates were in the front row, and they asked the toughest questions. And so it was really the sense of knowledge and also thinking about solutions. And again, I think PSC Partners really demonstrates how the knowledge that is gained by the whole community is so important in terms of understanding the disease and recommend specific solutions. The sense of community. And yes, we had specific organizations like ACT UP that were very, very prominent, but there was also a sense of community across everyone that was affected by the disease. Not just the gay men, for example, that you have seen in some of the pictures. Accountability was extremely important. It was accountability within the advocacy organizations, but also asking for accountability within government organizations, academic research networks, etc. And most of all, also leadership. Leadership within the organizations themselves that were advocating for changes to how things are done, but also connecting to the leadership in government. We all know Tony Fauci now as the COVID expert, but he was really one of the first people the AIDS activists targeted. And he immediately got it. He said, when they kind of stormed the NIH, he got it. He said, I'm not going to just tell them to go away. I'm going to go out there and talk to them. And then that actually invited them to come in and talk with him as well. And that's where a lot of this initial communication took place and the ability of patients to then get involved in the actual research agenda. Next slide, please. So what has changed as a result of all of this advocacy? Well, the first point I think that's really important is how research is conducted. As I mentioned, these people were not shy. They stormed the NIH, they stormed the FDA. But basically what's happened as a result is that every NIH-funded research network has a patient advisory board, a community advisory board with it. Patients are asked about their preferences in how trials are designed and how they're conducted. And this is now true, not just in the US, but for any federally funded research that's conducted anywhere in the world. And of course, it's become a norm, not just for HIV, but for other diseases as well. And of course, around the world, also for research funded by non-US sources. How drugs are approved, that was very, very important. So basically, once we had a bit of a signal of a drug that could actually work, for example, AZT, our first drug that was approved for HIV, basically, it was approved based on a partially completed, an interim analysis of a phase 2b study. But what the activists really demanded was a much more rapid review process, and this whole idea of, first of all, expanded access to drugs, and then also accelerated approval was one of the outcomes. And of course, also how patients engage. And that's now, when we hear things like PFDD and the patient voice, that's of course much more common on. But you have to remember that in those days, it was extremely, extremely novel. Next slide, please. Just another image of some of the activities, including the quilt. Next slide, please. And so we had some significant areas of impact with the FDA regulatory path, as I've already mentioned. Also in terms of clinical care, a lot of policy changes. And for example, the Ryan White Care Act is instrumental as a safety net for people with HIV and AIDS. And of course, clinical research, where we have really evolved into patient-driven clinical trial designs. Next slide, please. And that's really all I wanted to say. And it's all about being stronger with knowledge. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. It's such a fascinating history and very encouraging for us, but also even better to hear from someone who was involved in it. Thank you. Could we please launch the last poll? As we bring your voice into future discussions, in which ways would you be interested in participating? Choose all that apply. I want to attend more webinars. I would like to complete patient caregiver surveys. I am hoping to attend the 2022 conference in person. I want to share my ideas and/or questions on the PSC Partners Roadmap webpage. I would like to keep up to date with registry updates. I would like to share my ideas for future meetings. I would like to attend research discussion meetings. Well, we have 85% of the attendees are hoping to attend the 2022 conference, so that's super exciting. And 81% are interested in attending more webinars, and most of the other options have interest. So great, so excellent to see that there's enthusiasm for participating, and stay tuned. And Ricky, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, Mary. So tonight we are really thrilled to introduce to the PSC community Dr. Ruth-Anne Pai, who's our new Director of Research Strategy. Dr. Pai has recently completed her PhD in immunology at the University of Pennsylvania. Her PhD dissertation included identification of 2 new treatments for an idiopathic form of Castleman disease, which is another rare disease with liver involvement. Before joining our staff, Dr. Pai served as a part-time science advisor for us, and her expertise and leadership skills have already made an impact on our research programs. Dr. Pai will give a presentation on collaborative research networks in practice, the creative model that PSC Partners is now embracing. Go ahead, Dr. Pai.
Thank you so much, Ricky, for that really kind introduction. So we can progress to the next slide, please. I am Ruth-Anne Pai. As Ricky mentioned, I'm the new Director of Research Strategy for PSC Partners Seeking a Cure. And I wanted to take this opportunity also to introduce myself to all of you. As Ricky mentioned, I just completed my PhD in immunology at Penn studying Castleman disease. And through my work with the Castleman Disease Collaborative Network, met all of the amazing people at CZI with the RARES1 group, and they connected me to PSC Partners as a science advisor. And next slide, please. I'm very excited to now be dedicating all of my time towards research and research strategy for PSC with PSC Partners Seeking a Cure. Next slide, please. But what I want to talk about today is what I'm bringing with me from my past 5 years of experience with the CDCN, and in particular, give you some more information about this collaborative research network strategy. Next slide, please. So before we get into the collaborative research network, let's talk a little bit about what research has historically looked like. It's really this linear approach where as patients, as a patient network, we can fundraise for studies, announce a grant program, select the best researcher, and provide them the funding to complete the study. Many times those researchers go off, sometimes the studies are not completed, and also when we're really fortunate, we do uncover some exciting understandings of the disease. But we are taking on a different approach, thinking about a collaborative research network that's less linear and involves all of us, including our voices as patients. Next, please. So the collaborative network approach, next, please. And one more. The first step of this collaborative network approach is to build this community. And we're already here. We're here as patients, we're here with our researchers and clinicians to build this network. And we're going to be working on this over the next year. The next step, in step 2, is to crowdsource ideas for all of us to share our questions, our needs, what we think is really important for PSC research. And then in step 3, we'll then be able to come together with a research agenda and identify the top researchers to answer each of these questions. And in step 4, with each of those questions identified, fundraise for these specific questions. With funding in hand, we proceed to step 5, where it's really important for all of us as patients to contribute our clinical information and our samples for research so that we can provide those to these top researchers with the funding for that study that we've prioritized in step 6. The researchers will execute those studies, and then in step 7, analyze those data. And the goal of the collaborative research network is to identify drugs, right? New treatments, and potentially drugs that we can repurpose. And then in step 8, to take everything that we've learned through this process together with researchers and clinicians to disseminate this knowledge and continue the cycle to fund, again, the most high impact studies and uncover new understandings and drugs. So next slide, please. The CDCN took on this approach back in 2012, and I want to give you just in a few minutes an understanding of how that succeeded and why. And the CDCN really prioritized patient needs in their collaborative research model. They also broke down the barriers and the silos between researchers and clinicians to ensure that funding went to the best study with the best researcher, and always focused on progressing us towards treatments and cures as opposed to individual careers, grants, or the academic mindset. So through step 1 and step 2, the CDCN prioritized studies. So I want to give you a brief understanding of how that works. How do we crowdsource for research ideas? Next slide, please. So phase 1 for the CDCN was to send out surveys to the full community. This survey included 3 questions. First of all, what research questions do you think are important to answer to have the greatest impact for patients? Next, what studies do you think will be able to answer these research questions? Do we need to collect blood? Do we need to study the liver? Questions like that. And then with all of those questions in hand, who are the top researchers that you know of to perform the studies described. Or maybe it's your clinician. Next slide, please. Now, with all these crowdsourced ideas, the CDCN took this list to the Scientific Advisory Board, and they met to discuss 4 important factors to finalize this agenda. First of all, the likely impact the work would have on patient outcomes. Second, the importance of these research questions to furthering our understanding of Castleman disease. Next, the feasibility of the project. Will we actually be able to complete this research? And finally, the rational order of research. Do we need to identify a cell type before we study it, for example? So then with this list that was crowdsourced from the community and organized by the Scientific Advisory Board, we progressed to phase 3. Next slide, please. With our complete research agenda starting in 2015, the CDCN took on these research projects, found the perfect collaborators and researchers to perform the work, fundraised for these specific studies, enrolled patients in their registry, and collected samples to enable the research to happen. And all of these researchers across the world who received samples through the CDCN completed their studies, analyzed their data, and shared them back with the community and the leadership team at the CDCN. And through that, new biomarkers and new treatments were identified between 2012 and 2020. So I want to walk you through what that looks like on the next slide. In 2012, we had a really poor understanding of Castleman disease and not that much infrastructure or organization to get us off the ground. But by 2020, what we had accomplished was, next please. And one more, please. More than $10 million in translational research funding and the first NIH grant ever to study Castleman disease, and more than 1,000 patients in the contact registry who are willing and excited to contribute samples for research. Next, we also generated one collaborative network all together of clinicians, researchers, and patients, and unified our research agenda. We also developed the first biobank where samples are collected all together and available for research. Next, please. Now, for Castleman disease, there are still a lot of questions that remain. We still don't know the cause, and we don't know a lot of the mechanisms. But as I'll get to in a second, this work identified a number of potential drug targets. And through the registry, we were also able to put forth the first diagnostic criteria to ensure easy and rapid diagnosis of Castleman disease and the first treatment guidelines. Next, please. And finally, the first predictive biomarker was identified to predict before treatment who's likely to respond to the only FDA-approved drug, which is now approved. And we also identified 2 drugs that are in development for Castleman disease. I'm really excited to say that,
2 minutes.
Thanks, Megan, that altogether, this collaborative approach led to the identification of 2 drug targets for Castleman disease. Next, please. So now, how can we take this approach and apply it to PSC? Well, we're all here tonight to get this started, and I'm really excited that we can discuss all of this tonight. Next slide, please. And in particular, you might be asking, how do you fit into this collaborative network, and what is your role? What can you provide? Well, there's so much that you all can provide as patients and caregivers and as part of the community. First of all, your voices are very critical, your questions, your experiences. You can all provide your experience and your symptoms and your medical history through the registry, and also through all of these crowdsourcing efforts and on the website for Roadmap can provide your concerns, your needs, and your questions. All of these will inform our end goal, which is our research strategy. And aside from your voices, you can also provide samples for research, enroll in the registry, and support fundraising to make all of these research projects feasible. And you're not just patients, you also are leaders, you're collaborators, contributors, fundraisers, educators, and more. We're all here together at the same table leading up to our conference next year. Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? We're really already started. We're already on the road with our roadmap. So please join the conversation with all of us. Through Roadmap and into the conference next year with this collaborative research network, we aim to identify the most high impact research questions that will guide us towards new treatments for PSC. After generating the research agenda, we'll identify the best researchers to do the work all together. We'll fundraise together for the high priority studies, and all together with researchers and clinicians, we will further our understanding of PSC and uncover the biology, and ultimately identify treatments and predict who's likely to respond. Next slide, please. So with all that, I want to thank all of you. I'm really excited to get to know everyone in the community, and I'll pass it back over to Ricky.
Thank you, Dr. Pai, for sharing your plans on how this collaborative model will work for PSC Partners. And we are all so excited to have you leading our team through this roadmap initiative. And Dr. Pai will stay on for a while to answer any questions that come up. So our next speaker is Dr. Terry Jo Bishell, who's the founder and director of Combined Brain, a patient-led advocacy organization whose mission is to identify outcome measures and biomarkers for neurodevelopmental disorders. Dr. Bishell worked as a nurse midwife until her 5th child was diagnosed with Angelman syndrome in 2000. She then went back to school to earn a PhD in neuroscience from Vanderbilt University. As an interim science advice for us, she has been just really wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Bishell.
Thank you so much, Ricky. I have really enjoyed working with everyone at PSC Partners and moving from the brain into the liver. It's been a big learning curve for me, and it's been absolutely inspiring and amazing. And I have to say, being able to hear today the presentations from all the different speakers you've had already, it really shows me how important it is to you all to include the patient voice. And it is the most important thing in drug development. And I'm about to talk to you about a cautionary tale when the patient voice is not included. And in my personal experience, because I represent disorders of rare neurodevelopmental disorders, these are usually people who are actually unable to speak. So their voice has to be provided by parents, family members, and caregivers. You all can provide your own voices, and we need you to in order to make the clinical trials work and to prepare for treatments and cures. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of examples of failed trials. And these are, this first one that I'm going to talk about is in the field of neurodevelopment. And so some of you may already know about Fragile X. It's actually the most common genetic cause of autism in North America for sure. And it's got a known genetic cause, meaning that we ought to be able to figure out some good treatments and possible ways of making people's lives better who have Fragile X. People with Fragile X are mostly boys, and although women can be carriers. And there are a lot of issues with Fragile X, which include behavior, cognition, some motor issues, a lot of different kinds of symptoms. So there was a drug, it looked really promising in 2014. A lot of studies were done on mice and animals and models, cell models, and it really looked like it could work. In the mice, what it did was boost sociability. So just in case you don't know, there are tests to see how sociable mice might be. They're put in a cage with a stranger mice, and if they seem to want to get to know the stranger mouse, that shows that they're sociable. If they avoid the stranger mouse, that's actually considered to be a symptom of autism in mice. So in these mice, this medication, which was called mavoglurant, was showed that it helped the mice become a lot more sociable. So when they decided to develop this drug and bring it to market, it was looked at as a treatment for behavior, for some of the autistic traits and behavior in the people with Fragile X. So if you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Well, what happened is that it didn't really improve the behavior. And this is a complicated result of the study, because it probably did improve the behavior somewhat, but it didn't improve it over placebo. And I'm going to talk a second more about the placebo effect and the pitfalls of the placebo effect in my next slide, but don't change the slide yet. What the families reported is that even though it didn't really improve the behavior, it seemed to improve cognition. So now, if you had asked the families ahead of time, or even the gentlemen themselves with Fragile X and the boys with Fragile X, what would have mattered to them, maybe they would have said behavior, or maybe they would have said something else. And cognition is complicated. It can have to do with memory. It can have to do with judgment. It can have to do with following a whole bunch of directions. It can have to do with how to act in social situations. All of those things have to do with cognition. And so because the trials were only measuring behavior and not cognition, the drug was not approved by the FDA. It didn't pass clinical trials. And a lot of the families were really disappointed because they had seen their sons doing much better on the drug. The drug was also, the study was also a short-term study. And when you really think about cognition and how long it would take to show a difference, then you know it might take a long time to learn all new skills and ways of thinking, which, I mean, you can translate that to PSC, because if you're looking at the endpoint of transplant, it might take a long time to show whether quality of life, whether patients are feeling better for a long time before you prolong maybe the time to transplant. So at any rate, Dr. Lisbury Kravis, who's in this picture, she took on the task of trying to tease out a better way to measure these effects of these medications in people with Fragile X. And the very first step was to ask people with Fragile X and their families what really matters to them. What do they care about? And how can their lives be made better? That's where the patient voice really comes in and is so important. So if you can show the next slide. So you heard at the beginning from Dr. Bowlus, I believe, who actually mentioned that in some of the results that you've already gotten from your registry data, you showed that the length of time to transplant is actually longer in the people who answer the registry. And what that shows is that either people who go ahead and answer questions on the registry are already a little bit healthier or maybe a little different than the patients who are treated at a transplant center. And so it's a tricky thing. You could actually say the registry itself is a treatment for PSC, right? Just the registry, participating in the registry prolongs your time to transplant. But that, of course, is silly. It's probably because the people who are answering the questions in the registry are a self-selected population. So the problem often with studies is that the placebo itself is a bit of a treatment. And so what was happening in some of these Fragile X trials was that the placebo effect was so high that even though the drug did work, it worked only a little bit better than placebo. And so because of that, it also couldn't show a big effect. So I
Dr. Bishell,
am
we have about a minute and a half left.
okay, good. I think that's all I need. So what's really important about that is because natural history can also be used as a control. And so all of your participation in the registry is so crucial. So you're telling the researchers what matters to you, what research questions to ask, participating in the registry. It's all part of making successful clinical trials for treatments and cures. So can you show the next slide? So in fact, that's another example. This is another example of a drug that really worked great for a particular biomarker, which was cholesterol. It improved cholesterol by a huge amount, better than any other cholesterol drug really had done before. But it turns out it didn't change anything that mattered to the families. It didn't change anything that mattered to the patients because it didn't reduce heart attacks, strokes, angina, or death by cardiovascular event. So this is another example where it's what we have to ask the patient, what matters to you? Does your cholesterol level matter? Does your liver enzyme level matter? Or does something else matter to you when you're looking at PSC? So if you can go to the last slide. So I just want to commend you on having already engaged the FDA. You've already done a patient-focused drug development meeting, and the FDA wants to hear from patients. The FDA wants to know what matters to you. The FDA doesn't want these kind of trials like happened in Fragile X and like happened with that cholesterol drug. They want drugs to succeed that are really going to help patients. And so back to the Fragile X example, there's now a new study that Dr. Barry Kravis has championed based on what matters to families. And hopefully now we will find out whether that drug really will be working for patients or not. So I just want to conclude by saying thank you so much for allowing me to work on this, to learn about PSC and to meet the community. It's really been fantastic. And back to Ricky.
Thank you, Dr. Bishell, for those meaningful examples of the importance of our patient input. I think we've all heard your message. So our last speaker tonight is Dr. Jesse Kirkpatrick. Dr. Kirkpatrick has been committed to the mission of PSC Partners since 2010, when a family member was diagnosed. A senior in high school at the time, he decided to pursue a career as a scientist with the goal of answering key unsolved questions in PSC. He has already completed his PhD at MIT and is now a postdoctoral researcher using engineered bile ducts in a dish to shed light on the cause of PSC and help identify effective therapies. This year, Dr. Kirkpatrick will start medical school in the hopes of becoming a physician scientist. He joined the PSC Partners Board of Directors last year. Dr. Kirkpatrick's topic tonight is a scientist/family member perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky. I wanted to start by sharing a story that I think will feel familiar to many of us. I was a senior in high school when my family received the diagnosis that would change our lives. At the time, none of us had ever heard of PSC. So we turned to the internet, where we discovered those grim facts and figures that define our disease. We learned that people with PSC are expected to live just about a decade before requiring a liver transplant. That 1 in 10 will develop bile duct cancer. There's no cure, and not even a therapy that can slow the course of the disease. There's never been a time in my life when I have felt as powerless as I did that day. Now, powerlessness is not an unreasonable emotion to feel when faced with a life-threatening disease that we can't really do anything to stop. But as it turns out, we, as a community of patients and their loved ones, actually have an incredible amount of power. We've lived with this disease, maybe for just a month, maybe for decades. We've thought about it more than almost anyone else in the world. We've almost definitely come up with ideas or questions that no one has ever considered before. We know better than anyone what matters to us most, whether it's stopping the itch, detecting cancer when it's still early and treatable, or finding a way to stop or reverse this disease. Maybe most importantly, we have a sense of urgency, this unrelenting will to put an end to PSC as quickly as possible. The Roadmap Initiative will empower us to achieve what I see as our enormous collective potential. First, we'll have the opportunity to learn from scientific and medical experts about what is known and unknown about PSC. We'll establish a common vocabulary and a common base of knowledge. We'll get answers to the questions that we may have been asking ourselves for months or years. Is PSC a genetic disease? What role do the immune system, bile acids, and the microbiome play? What even is a microbiome? With all this knowledge in hand, we can then begin to identify the most urgent, unmet needs and advocate for the research studies that we believe have the highest potential to satisfy them. We can ask tough questions and promote productive dialogue. We can collaborate with and better support the incredible physicians and scientists who have dedicated their careers to our rare disease. We can use our stories to inspire young researchers to take an interest in joining our quest for a cure. Not long after my family member was diagnosed, I started going to a nearby medical center after school to help a hepatologist with data entry for a clinical trial that she was running in PSC. Now I've completed a PhD in cancer diagnostics. I'm pursuing a postdoc in PSC research, and I'll begin medical school this summer on my path to a career as a hepatologist and PSC researcher. Having a personal connection to a disease can feel like a terrible weight that we live with every day. But I've learned over the past 10 years that it's also an incredible asset that gives us a unique perspective and sense of motivation that is impossible to come by otherwise. We all share this connection, and it's time that we harness it to finally, once and for all, put a stop to PSC. Thank you, and I'd like to turn it over to Ricky and Mary now.
Thank you so much, Jesse. We are so lucky to have you on board and have your wonderful perspective to keep leading us. So we would just really like to offer a heartfelt thank you to all of our 6 panelists who have beautifully laid the groundwork for the start of our Roadmap Initiative on our journey to the 2022 annual conference. We hope that everyone listening tonight has a bit of an understanding of what your crucial role is in all of this. Each and every one of you has a unique experience to offer and to share, and you are integral to the success of our Roadmap Initiative. If you still have questions, please send them to us on the Roadmap Initiative page on our website. Throughout the year, we will be holding virtual meetings, and we hope that you will attend as many as possible. If you miss any webinars, they will all be recorded and posted on our website. Please stay in touch with us and share your comments, ideas, and questions. Here's a quick update. Visit our website to participate in future Roadmap events. Save, of course, the Boston conference dates, June 2nd through 5th of 2022. Join our patient registry. You've heard a lot about it tonight. Visit links to updated COVID-19 information. Sign up for our mailing list and follow us on social media. Go to our events page to watch for future Zoom rooms. PSC teens ages 13 through 20 will be April 28th and June 29th. PSC patients ages 18 and up will be May 11th. Caregivers, spouses, and parents will be June 11th. Mary, would you like to tell us just a little bit about some of the things that are going on in Canada?
Thank you, Ricky. Just a reminder that Canadians can visit pscpartners.ca for Canadian specific content. And please also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. If you'd like to receive quarterly Canadian Lunduct newsletters, please join our mailing list. I also wanted to let everybody know that the Canadian fundraising team is working hard to prepare for a June virtual auction. We are seeking items that can be either US-based or Canada-based. Gift certificates would be ideal for our snowbirds or small items that are easily mailable or delivered virtually, such as a service or a lesson. Another possibility would be a vacation spot where Canadians could come to visit. Please let us know if you would like to help. We will give you the tools. This is a tangible opportunity for your friends who ask how they can help. Ask them to provide an auction item. Just email us at contactus@pscpartners.ca to get in touch. And thank you, everybody, attendees and presenters, for being here and for participating. Please take the survey that will pop up, as Ricky said, and keep your eyes open for the yet to be named Friendly Liver as we communicate upcoming roadmap events.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Good night.
Good night.